Richard Schmidt, who has a noticing hypothesis based on the idea that we need to deliberately notice, that if we don't make a deliberate effort to notice something, we won't acquire that word or structure. I humbly disagree. That has simply not been my experience. Today, I want to talk about noticing in the process of acquiring a language. Now, you may have heard me say that there are only three things that matter in language learning: the attitude of the learner, and I have gone into greater detail as to what that attitude, a positive and an effective attitude, consists of. The second thing is the time that the learner spends with the language, not reading explanations in their own language, but engaged with the language. But the third one is the ability to notice. So what do we mean by this ability to notice? And I'm often asked about that. So I thought I would do a video on that subject. I should point out that I heard this from a professor, and I think the head of the language department at San Diego State University, when I attended the American Council of Teachers of Foreign Languages convention in San Diego about 5 years ago. I tried searching on the internet to find the name of this person, because that has stuck with me ever since, because I think it's such an accurate description of what really matters in language learning. But I can't find her name. So if anyone out there knows, please let me know. At any rate, what do we mean by noticing? I did some research again on Google, and I found a certain Richard Schmidt, who has a noticing hypothesis. But his noticing hypothesis is based on the idea that we need to deliberately notice, that if we don't make a deliberate effort to notice something, we won't acquire that word or structure. And he based this on his experience in Brazil learning Portuguese, and you can Google and you can see what he had to say. I humbly disagree. That has simply not been my experience. My experience is that noticing is something we do in everything in life. Noticing is how the brain identifies patterns, situations, predicts what is coming so that we can lead our lives. If I walk through the forest and I follow a path through the forest, if I'm used to walking there, I will perhaps notice fewer things because I've already noticed them before and they become part of my knowledge base. If there's something new there, a broken tree, some bear poop, anything that's new, I'm likely to notice. Obviously, some people notice more than others. Some people may go through that forest and not see a particularly, a rare plant or flower. So our ability to notice will vary, but we don't necessarily have to deliberately try to notice things. It's something the brain is doing for us all the time. So that's the first thing about noticing. To my mind, it's a natural thing. It's part of how we acquire knowledge, including how we acquire languages. The brain is a pattern recognition machine, and that means it is constantly noticing some things. Now, the things that we notice, it can be such things as, I know when I start into a new language, all of a sudden I start to notice where one word ends and the next word begins, even though I don't know the meaning of these words. So I'm starting to notice some limits, some audio, some characteristics of the audio of what I'm listening to. It's a very early stage in my sort of process of noticing more and more things in the language as I acquire the language. And this is not sort of linear. I don't acquire more and more and not forget any. I notice things. I forget that I noticed them before. I notice them again. It's very much a haphazard process, but it goes on, in my experience, naturally. The next thing that I start to notice, if I go to link and put up, Finnish or Icelandic, I will notice that some words appear more often than others. And typically it's going to be the words like the, and things of this nature. I don't yet know what these words mean, but I start to notice that some words appear more often than others, and this is part of this gradual process of noticing the language. If I'm dealing with an inflected language, I start to notice that some endings change, in some cases suffixes change, prefixes change, various things change. I start to notice that they change. I don't yet know why. My curiosity perhaps is triggered, and I'm still sort of starting to put the pieces together, much like a jigsaw puzzle. The more things I've already noticed, the more new things I start to notice, things that passed me by the first time. If we are overwhelmed by so many new things, we don't notice as much. If we have some things that we are already familiar with, we will notice some other things as being new and different. So obviously pronunciation is something that we at first have trouble noticing. I didn't notice at first that, for example, in Russian, the unaccentuated O sounds more like an A sound, but in time I start to notice that. We start to notice the connection between the writing system and the pronunciation. But in some cases, people who speak a language quite well still haven't noticed. I have mentioned before, for example, my father, who was very fluent in English, would always say Nova Scotia, even though he's quite capable of making the sound sh, sh. So it's Nova Scotia in English. But he was still not willing to, notice that, in fact, the value of those letters in English was different from, say, Czech. Similarly, when I was reading Russian, even though I knew that the letter that looks like a P, in fact, is pronounced R, I've noticed it, but it hasn't become a habit yet. But still, through a gradual process of noticing, forgetting, not necessarily deliberately noticing, these things become a part of my knowledge base, and now I can notice some other things. I think that's a key consideration, that if everything is new and different, it's very difficult to notice things in that sort of maze of things that are new and different and incomprehensible. But I've noticed many times, for example, with the mini stories at Link, if I go back to them, whereas the first few times I listen, it's all very new and different and conceivably just noise, and I start to recognize more and more words over time. But if 6 months later I go back to that mini story, I will notice a vocabulary item, not deliberately, but I just notice it, or a structure that was always there, but I never noticed it. And so there is this idea that through repetition and after a period of time, we go back in, and as other things have become known, we start to notice new things. And that's all part of how noticing helps us acquire language. Now, one thing about noticing is that we have to notice how some things in a new language are different, and we have a prejudice for things that we are familiar with. So, as I mentioned, the example of the letter that looks like a P in English, naturally I tend to want to pronounce it like a P. If we have words like false friends, we will naturally want to assume that the word has the same meaning in the new language, even though it has a different meaning. And so, an important part of learning a new language is to develop that ability to suppress some things that are very familiar and comfortable but don't work in the new language. And we start to notice gradually. The thing about noticing, too, is that as we notice more and more new things, and as they become a part of our knowledge base and skill base, then we don't notice them anymore. They're now taken for granted, and we start to notice some other things that we hadn't noticed before. So, to what extent do we need to deliberately notice? To some extent, we do. We have to have an open mind towards the new language and not assume that it's the same as languages we are already familiar with. We have to be open to noticing things. We have to be interested. I think a major contributor to our ability to notice is simply the fact that we expose ourselves to a lot of content, so that over time, the brain is able to create the necessary connections, recognize the patterns that we need. But that does require a massive amount of input, listening and reading. So I think it is possible that to have a pattern pointed out might improve our ability to notice that. We'll certainly notice it the time it's pointed out, or say if we're corrected in speaking, that might help us notice. No guarantee we won't make the same mistake again, but it can help us notice. But the number of times when that deliberate noticing or being corrected can help us is a relatively small, in my experience, a small part of the total process. Just as children gradually improve their grammar and usage based on the massive amount of content, meaningful content that they listen to and read, rather than being corrected by their parent or the teacher. So along the same lines, if we talk about deliberate noticing or helping people to notice, my own experience is that rather than doing exercises and drills, if we can have access to examples of different patterns in the language and concentrate on reviewing these patterns in those examples with a minimum amount of explanation, that is a very effective way of helping us to notice. So, because those examples are going to be embedded in a relatively meaningful content. Obviously, if we are consuming massive amounts of input, meaningful input on a variety of subjects, both listening and reading, that's a more meaningful sample of content where we have an opportunity to notice things, and we will notice things, but we won't notice everything. So, it's not perfect, and some people will notice more things than others, but it is a big part of how we acquire new languages. I know myself that if I read a grammar book or even a starter book in a new language, if there are too many things explained, too many things pointed out, and I feel that I have this responsibility to learn all these things, I find that a bit intimidating. It's almost like too much clutter. Whereas if I can be exposed to meaningful content in a language, more or less at my level, I'm quite happy to let my brain start to notice things and gradually acquire that knowledge and trust that the brain will create the necessary connections, recognize the necessary patterns, so that eventually I have a high level of comprehension in the language, I have sufficient vocabulary in the language, that I'm able to predict what's coming when I listen and read, and that's going to enable me eventually to use that to speak comfortably in the language. So there you have it, my take on what is meant by noticing